On the afternoon of January 2nd, 1935, a man by the name of Roland T. Owen walked into the President Hotel and asked for a room several floors up. Given his name, Roland T. Owen, with a Los Angeles address, he was well dressed and had no bags with him. A bellboy at the hotel accompanied Roland all the way up to the 10th floor. On the way up, Roland told him that he had previously spent the night at the Muhlbach Hotel but found the rates way too expensive. The bellboy watched as Roland unpacked, where he took out a hairbrush, a comb, and some toothpaste from his overcoat pocket. After Roland put those items above the sink, the bellboy and Roland will soon leave the room. The bellboy returned to lock it and will give Roland the key. After returning to the lobby, he saw Roland leaving the hotel and just to go on about his business. A maid who worked at the hotel returned from a day off to work the afternoon shift, so she clocked in, did her daily routines, and would eventually make her way up to room 1046. She knocked on the door, got no answer, went inside, and was surprised to see Roland in the room. Since the previous night, a woman had been staying in the room. She apologized, and Roland would say, "Oh no need to apologize, just go ahead and do your thing." So she smiled and would start cleaning the room. While cleaning, she noticed that the room was a bit dark. The shades were drawn and the lights were dim. She found it to be a bit odd, but didn't think too much of it. This would remain the case for when she encountered Roland in the room on several occasions. While cleaning, she noticed that Roland put on his coat, brushed his hair, and he would ask, "Hey, can you leave the room unlocked? I'm gonna have some friends over later on." The maid did as he asked, and he would soon leave the room. Later on that day, around 4 p.m., the maid would return to Roland's hotel room with fresh towels. Again, inside the room was dark, and she saw Roland lying on the bed fully dressed. Visible in the light from the hallway was a note on his bedside that read, "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The maid would drop off the towels and would soon leave the room. The next morning, on January 3rd, she returned to room 1046 around 10:30 a.m. The door was locked, which she believed Roland was probably out somewhere since the door was locked from the outside. But when she opened it, she found that Roland again was present in the room, once again sitting in the dark, just exactly where he had been the previous afternoon. The maid, feeling a bit puzzled at this point, tried not to think too much of it and just went on to clean the room. The phone began to ring. Roland answered it. The maid would overhear the conversation as Roland at one point would say, "No, Don, I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry. No," he said calmly. While holding the phone, Roland would ask the maid about her job as she cleaned. He wanted to know if she was responsible for the entire floor, and if the president was residential. He started repeating his complaints to the maid from the previous conversation that he had had with the bellboy, complaining about the Muhlbach Hotel expensive rates. The maid would get a good laugh out of this and would soon leave the room. Again, around 4 p.m., the maid would return to room 1046 with fresh towels, and this time she could hear two men talking as she knocked.
"I thought you said you were going to get this done. What happened?"
"Look, Don, just relax. Yeah, I got this. Bear with me. I'm going to get this done."
And a voice very loud and deep that was probably not from Roland asked,
"Who is it?"
The maid responded that she had just brought fresh towels, to which the voice responded,
"We don't need any."
The maid found this to be a bit odd since she knew there was no towels in the room, because she had taken them early in the morning herself. So, not thinking too much of it, she left and would attend to the other residents. 2 hours later, a woman by the name of Jean Owen checked into the President Hotel after having shopped in the city for a few hours. Feeling sick, she had decided not to drive back home that night. She was given room 1048. Her boyfriend, who worked in a flower shop in the city, came to visit her there at 9:20 p.m. Later that night, she would hear a commotion coming from room 1046. It sounded like a man and a woman arguing. She wasn't the only person to overhear this commotion, as another hotel employee who was the elevator operator, Charles Blocker, who began his shift just around midnight. Blocker recalled one visitor in particular, a woman he had seen at the hotel visiting male guests in their rooms on other occasions, and thus believed to be a prostitute, a conclusion shared by other hotel staff who were familiar with her. She came in first sometime during his first 3 hours. He took her to the 10th floor where she would ask about room 1046. 5 minutes later, the elevator was summoned there again. It turned to be the same woman who expressed puzzlement that her client was not in room 1046. Since she said he had called her and on previous visits with him, he had always been present. She wondered if in fact he was in room 1024, since she could see through the room's transom window that the light was on in there. She remained on the floor after the conversation. A half hour later, Blocker got another signal to take the elevator back to the 10th floor. The woman was waiting again and he took her down to the lobby. An hour later, he took her and a different man to the 9th floor. A call from that floor turned out to be the woman. He took her to the lobby and she left the hotel for the night. Another call to the 9th floor 15 minutes later turned out to be the man who had come up with her. He told Blocker that he could not sleep and was going out for a walk. The next day, January 4th, a new switchboard operator, Della Ferguson, came on shift. She was preparing to make a requested wake-up call to room 1046 when she noticed a light indicating that the phone there was off the hook. The bellboy who had previously assisted Roland to his room drew the assignment and walked to the room. The door to the room was locked, with a do not disturb sign hanging from the doorknob. He knocked several times until he heard a voice from the inside tell him,
"Come on in, man, the door is open."
However, the door was locked, so he couldn't enter. The same voice would again tell him,
"Can you turn on the lights?"
But the bellboy still could not enter. The bellboy then shouted through the door to hang up the phone and left. The bellboy then told Ferguson that the guest in room 1046 was probably drunk and that she should wait another hour. Around 8:30 a.m., the phone still had not been hung up, and another bellboy was sent to the 10th floor to room 1046. The do not disturb sign was still on the doorknob, and it was still locked. But the bellboy had a key and would let himself into the room. Inside, he found the room dark and Roland naked, apparently drunk out of his damn mind. The light from the hallway showed some dark spots on the bedding, but rather than turn on the lights, the bellboy saw that the phone had been knocked on the floor and he put it back on the stand, replacing the handset. 2 hours later, around 10:30 a.m., another operator reported that the phone in room 1046 was once again off the hook. Again, the bellboy was sent to the room to see what the hell was going on. He saw that the do not disturb sign was still on the doorknob. He knocked on the door, there was no answer, he let himself into the room, and what he saw next was absolutely terrifying. Roland T. Owen was on his knees, bloodied and beaten half to death. The bellboy, startled to death, turned on the light, put the phone back on the hook, and he saw that there was blood all around the walls, the bathroom, and on the bed itself. So he ran out of the room and called for help. The bellboy came back upstairs with the assistant manager, but when they did, they could only open the door about 6 inches, as Roland had fallen on the floor next to it. So he was sort of blocking the way, but when they got inside, he went and sat on the edge of the bathtub. The manager then called the police and they were joined by a doctor from the hospital. Roland had been bound with a cord around his neck, wrists, and ankles. His neck had further bruising, suggesting that someone had been attempting to strangle him. He had been stabbed more than once in the chest above his heart, and one of these wounds had punctured his lung. Blows to the head had left him with a skull fracture on the right side, and in addition to the blood the bellboy had seen, there was also blood on the ceiling. Dr. Flanders, who worked at the Kansas City General Hospital, cut the cords from Roland's wrists and asked him, "Hey, who did this to you?" Roland, who was barely conscious at this point, eventually said, "Nobody." When he asked what had caused these injuries, Roland said to him he had fallen and hit his head on the bathtub. The doctor knew he had to be lying, but still managed to ask if he had been trying to kill himself. Roland responded with no and would lose consciousness soon thereafter, where he would soon be rushed to the hospital and would die shortly after on midnight January 5th, 1935. Doctors performed an autopsy on Roland and determined that he had died from his wounds. Dr. Flanders had examined not just the body, but the bloodstains in the room, since much of it had dried by the time he had arrived. He estimated the wounds had been inflicted between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. the day of, consistent with the first bellboy and the second one's observation. Detectives searching room 1046 took note as much of what they did not find as what they did. Consistent with what the bellboy had observed, there were no clothes in the closet or drawers. The only evidence of anything other than what Roland had been wearing was the tag of a necktie indicating it had been made by a New Jersey company. Also missing from the room were the soap, shampoo bottles, and towels provided by the hotel to every room. There were no knives, which led to the dismissal of suicide as a cause of death, since the stab wounds in his chest cannot be accounted for. The cords tying him up also suggested the involvement of other people. Detectives found some other items that might have been evidence: a hairpin, safety pin, an unsmoked cigarette, and a bottle full of acid. 4 fingerprints small enough to have been a woman's were found on the room's phone. They cannot be matched to Rowland's or to any of the hotel's employees who had been known to enter the room. The police sought help from the press. Both of the city's evening newspaper carried the story on their front pages the next day. Detective Johnson, who worked for the Kansas City Police Department, would later tell the press, "There is no doubt that someone else is mixed in all of this," confirming the case was indeed a homicide. It would later turn out during the investigation that Roland T. Owen was not his real name. In fact, there was no one in the area under that name. The police were puzzled. They didn't know what to make of this. So they kept the body and began to pursue the man's true identity. They called upon the community to come forward to identify the body so they could hopefully put the pieces tied to the investigation together. After some time would pass, the police hadn't yet identified the man who had called himself Roland T. Owen, so it was becoming a bit tiresome, and they wanted to give up. So they announced to the public that the unknown man be buried in a potter's field. A potter's field is a place in a cemetery or otherwise designated for unknown or unclaimed people, as well as people who can't afford a proper burial. That wasn't until the funeral home would receive an anonymous phone call.
Hello, I know you guys are looking for the person that killed Roland T. Owen and all, but I just want you to know that I'm willing to pay for the funeral, and I'll even send you the money to have him properly buried next to my sister.
The funeral director would ask how he knew of this person, and he stated,
Owen hadn't played the game fair, and cheaters always gets what's coming to them.
The funeral director then told him that they would need to forward this phone call over to the police, in which the man replied,
That doesn't bother me.
and then hung up. The caller would do as he said, and he sent money to the funeral, with a couple of roses and a card that simply read, Love Forever, Luis. An anonymous message delivered to another anonymous man absolutely baffled the police. And the police jumped right back into the investigation once again, knowing that if there was someone out there that knew who this man was, they would be able to figure it out. So they sent a letter with a picture of the deceased man asking the public to write in if they could identify him. Owen had a strange hexagon-shaped scar just above his ear, which was also pictured in the newspaper to help his identification. And right then and there, the police knew they had found this person's true identity. A woman by the name of Rudy Ogletree called the police and informed them that the deceased man known as Roland T. Owen was her son, Artemis Ogletree. A friend of Ruby in Birmingham, Alabama, showed her an issue of the American weekly newspaper that was covering the case. And Ruby said that the unidentified man looked a lot like her son, who she had last seen him when he had left to hitchhike in California of 1934, the year prior to his death. Artemis Ogletree had been born in Florida in 1915. Ruby contacted the Kansas City Police Department and was able to provide enough information about the previous anonymous corpse, including a description of his head scar, which she explained was the result of a childhood accident in which some hot grease had spilled there. In November, another issue of the supplement carried a story identifying the man as Artemis Ogletree and explaining how his identity had been determined. While that question had been answered, Ruby's account raised more questions. She had received several letters purportedly from her son after he had been killed. The first, early 1935, postmarked in Chicago, aroused her suspicion since it was typewritten, and as far as she knew, Artemis did not know how to type. It was also written in a highly colloquial style that was not consistent with his previous letters. In May of 1935, another letter written from Artemis said that he was going to Europe. It was followed by a special delivery letter saying that his ship was sailing that day, both of which was sent from New York. In August of that year, Ruby received a telephone call from Memphis, Tennessee. The man calling her told her that Artemis had saved him from a band of thieves in Cairo, Egypt, and that Artemis himself could not call because he was now living in Cairo, where he had married a wealthy woman and was well, and was unable to write because he had lost one of his thumbs in the fight where he had saved the caller. Ruby talked with the man for 45 minutes. She recalled that he spoke wildly and irrationally, but seemed to have first-hand knowledge of Artemis. The man identified himself as Godfrey Jordan, but Ruby told police that she believed he was actually Joe Simpson, a friend who Artemis left home with. Her conviction grew stronger upon confronting him on December 28, 1939, after several previous unsuccessful attempts. Simpson promised to give her a badly typed letter that Artemis allegedly wrote to him, but he had just never arrived at the appointed time to hand over the letter. If Artemis had at some point before his death gone to Egypt or anywhere else overseas, he had not done so under his own name. No steamship company at the time had any record that he had traveled with them. There was also no evidence that he had ever even been there. Information developed through the police's conversation with the Ruby Ogletree helped them establish a third hotel in Kansas City, the St. Regis, where Artemis had stayed. There he had shared a room with another man. Whether that had been Don cannot be established. In 1937, just 2 years after the murder, the New York City police arrested a man named Joseph Martin on a murder charge after he had killed a man he had shared a room with and put the body in a trunk to be shipped to Memphis. Among the several aliases, he was found to have used the name Donald Kelso. The Kansas City Police Department had matched samples of his handwriting to that in the letters written to Ruby Ogletree. No charges were ever filed against the man for the Ogletree case, and the Kansas City Police Department kept the case open. The file showed that different detectives reviewed the case every few years through the 1950s, but no new evidence was ever found, and the case would gradually start to go cold. And now we get to the theories. The telephone calls alleging that Ogletree was killed in retaliation for his broken engagement have provided support for that theory. Organized crime has also been considered, since the name Don can also be a title for a mafia boss. Lastly, it was also suggested that Don, whoever he was, killed Ogletree for some personal reasons, either with the help of the commercial woman that Blocher had seen in the hotel later that night, or by himself. Thank you so much for watching. I will try to at least post twice a week, and we'll dive into some more crazy ass stories. Thank you.